Okay.
All right. And then I'm actually going to share my screen here. You can just ignore it, but all right. First of all, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Before we actually get into this, did you have any questions about the paper? Were there any kind of areas that you were unsure about, or just any, general questions?
Right off the top of my head, no.
Okay. All right. So we're actually going to get a little bit more in depth with some of the writing here versus the first one, since the first essay was more about just organizing our ideas and getting the concepts there. And so now we're going to look at aspects where we can kind of alter the writing a little bit to make things a little bit more clear, concise, whatnot. So some of the elements they talk about. And they say, okay, so I'm going to weave that in as we have the discussion. So first of all, for the title, I think this works because the article is talking about social media and its potential negative effects. Just know that with the E, that needs to be capitalized. Okay, so you highlight that. Okay, so this is your attention getter right here, correct? Okay, so if you're saying you may not realize it, but social media ultimately has ruined your life without you even thinking about it. Okay. Now, if you leave the statement just like this and then jump right into in her article published, the way it stands, it sounds like this is what your statement is, like you're making that statement. And I wanted to be clear, is that your position or is that something that she's trying to emphasize?
That's something she's trying to convey.
Okay, so what you could do in this situation is continue that sentence to sort of attach it to that concept. So it might look something like, you may not realize it, but social media ultimately is ruining your life without you even thinking about it. And then you could say something like, or at least that's what's her name? Yeah. And then you can tie it like this, argues in her article published in the New York Times, I was wrong, too much tech is ruining lives, okay? And then you can, if you're doing that, obviously you can end it there. And then you can start again, and then you could just, with her last name. Wadhwa argues her stance on, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's something that you'll want to think about whenever you're introducing or if you're conducting an analysis or critical analysis on anything else, that you did give us our attention getter, but you're also making it clear that this is her discussion and what you're critiquing. All right.
Okay.
The next thing is this title. I know that the titles in articles are lowercase when you read them online, but because you're actually referencing them in your own essay, you're going to adhere to the traditional capitalization. Okay. So it would be, I was wrong. All right. So just like you would, like when you're putting in the works cited page. Okay. All right, so now moving on, Wadhwa argues her stance on the ever-changing internet and its effect on us as individuals every day, more specifically. And so I don't know if you had a chance to watch the comma videos, but you have what's called one of those introductory phrases where the comma would go after this, okay? So if you're saying more specifically, and then you'll notice that whatever comes after this comma would be a complete sentence. And since you have the semicolon there, we can check for it. So here she argues that social media, instead of improving our world, has worsened communication and socialization. So is that a complete sentence?
Yeah.
Okay, so then the comma would work here. So what this tells us when you have information like as an introductory element is you're just telling us more about what's supposed to follow or the relationship between these two, what comes before it. And since you said more specifically, that means you're telling the reader you're adding on to this information here, okay? All right, now you say thus leading us to a type of disconnect. This would be here, comma, leading us to a type of disconnect and suppression in our development as a social community. Okay. So this is her overall main argument. Now you kind of get into her claims here a little. You don't necessarily have to do that in the intro because you're going to talk about them throughout the paper anyway. But I want to ask you if you can highlight where your thesis is, just so I know.
You could see like where oh, okay.
Yeah, I can.
Mm.
So right where the word unfortunately is? Or
no,
gotcha.
Like,
okay.
Yeah, like right yeah, pretty much.
Okay. All right. Now, what I would suggest is probably let's see here.
Well, the unfortunately part, like it's part of thesis, but it's kind of like my intro, if that makes sense, into the thesis. Like,
okay, so you're saying you're saying that's not to say this argument shouldn't have light shed upon it or is worthless, but the way Waddick carries out her argument can be seen all around very lazy. Its methodology doesn't leave readers with him. Okay, what I would recommend, because a lot of this right here is kind of still vague, right? Well, we don't know what you necessarily mean by that. As well as the methodology, but you did kind of talk about what those things are up here. So my recommendation would be to actually integrate some of the information from this section into this. So here's what I mean by that. Let me actually I'm going to use your thesis. You see where I'm typing? So you can say something like, so you're saying the argument is weak. Is that what you're concluding?
Yeah, it's weak.
So you could say something like, overall WAD was... And then, so why was it weak? So you're claiming because it was lazy or whatever, but what did you think considered makes it lazy?
Well, just the amount of information she provides, like it's not enough.
Okay, so if you had to finish this sentence where it said because, could you do it? Can you type it in using some of the concepts you said before? Go ahead and do that.
Okay. Okay.
Well, okay, so what do you mean by enough information for the audience?
So in certain like claims that she gives, she like it's very vague, the information like that she gives and the evidence to support like her arguments. It's very vague and like very quick, very general information.
I think that that's something that you should include. So you can say overall Wadwa's argument was weak because she relied on, what did she rely on? You just said it, vague.
Vague.
Well, is it information or is it evidence?
It's a bit of both. It's well, in general, like what I mean by information is like background information, context, evidence.
That's what you'll need to say then.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. The only thing I would just suggest is you say instead for our audience, instead only providing vague and general context, and then I would just say as well as claims for her. Oops. I mean, as well as evidence. Sorry. As well as evidence for her claims. So that way it just kind of flows a little bit better than adding it. Okay, so now what that allows us to do, if you scroll back up, we can now eliminate, where is it? Okay, all of this. Okay, so now we have a little bit more of a clean intro because, like I said, a lot of what you said there, you're going to address later in the body paragraph anyway. And so now what you have is saying that, okay, I drew the conclusion that our argument is weak. And here's why, because you're going to address the not providing enough information, the fact that it's vague, it's general, and then addressing the evidence for the claims. Okay. Now, I noticed later in the paper, because I read through it briefly, is that you talk a little bit about fallacies, or at least you introduced, I think it was like one or two of them. And so we may end up having to revisit this thesis again. It just depends on what we're going to look at or what we may add or take away in the body paragraph. Okay. So just let you know at this time, this might just be a working thesis because depending on what we change later. All right. Okay. So now moving on. So the second paragraph is a summary. Okay. So right here, you say the article starts off with Wada's personal backstory. And then the predictions on the future on the internet used to be very so this part was a little confusing for me. Can you clarify what you're trying to communicate here?
So in the article, she kind of explains how like back in 2014 she wrote an article on like her predictions of where social media and tech would take us. So like this article is basically like in a way like a callback to how she was like extremely wrong about that and how it's like the complete opposite of what she predicted.
Okay. So when you say it's her personal backstory, this is the backstory being the predictions she made about the internet. Okay.
Her backstory.
Okay. So I think we need to clear this sentence up a little bit because it doesn't necessarily come off immediately that way. And here's why, because you have here, the article starts right off with Wada's personal backstory. And that to me sounds like a complete sentence, right? Because then you start off with her name again. And that attempts to convey that you're starting a new sentence, which is a little disconnected. So instead of doing that, we can say something like the article, and we'll start with starts right off. Is there another way that we can say starts right off?
Like right off the top of my head, no. I can't think of anything.
Well, what's the start of a story? What do we label that as usually?
Like at the beginning.
Yeah. So what can we say?
So at the beginning of the article.
Or we can say the article begins. Right?
Yeah.
Yep. So we can say the article begins. And the reason why I'm saying that is not necessarily to say that it's bad to say starts right off with, but we want to, because I already indicated that it could be a little unclear, right? And so if we have moments that we can clear it up as much as possible, it helps when we're trying to make those revisions to the sentence to clear that. So if we say the article begins with Wada's personal background story, and my question to you is, okay, so what's the background story? So instead of repeating her name, we can eliminate that, right? And say the article begins with Wada's personal background story or personal backstory, which included what? Her
predictions on where social media would take us.
Yep, which her predictions on the future, which included her predictions of the future about internet. Which included her predictions on the future of the internet used to be very positive, confident. So now, is she saying that she thinks this is what it was going to be?
Yeah, like.
Okay, so you can say
basically like explaining her outlook at the time as she explains it.
So you could just say which included her predictions that the internet would be used
would have a positive effect on.
Yeah. So you can say that the internet would have, right, a positive effect, just like you said. And then, so what did she say about this part?
So the reason I added skeptical was because in that portion of like the article, she kind of explains how her viewpoint was confident, but it was still like a bit like covered, in skepticism. She wasn't like completely 100% sure.
So I would probably suggest beginning a new sentence to do that, okay? Because what we have here is now her backstory, and she thinks it's going to have a positive effect, and then something changed, and then at the same time, right? You could say, does that work?
Yeah.
Or actually, we could say at that time, sorry, because we're talking about her backstory. Okay, great. So now we have the article begins with Wada's personal backstory, which included her predictions that the internet would have a positive effect. At that time, she was confident but skeptical, all at the same time. Okay. You could say at that time, you could say then if you want to. What I tend to do, and when I'm writing, if we see like a double use of the word, if that bothers you, it bothers me, but it doesn't have to bother you, right? If it does bother you and you're like, I don't really want to repeat that word, we could just eliminate that and say, then she was confident but skeptical all at the same time. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
So then we go on. These views held by her back in the year 2014 did not hold up very well, however. Her positive yet hesitant outlook of the future turned out to be the opposite. A world controlled by big tech. Okay, so these are, my question now, because this sounds like your analysis, but does she actually say this about herself in the article?
What do you mean, like like if she?
Well, when I read these views held by her back in the year 2000 did not hold up very well, it sounds like your point of view instead of her saying that.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm kind of like giving my point of view because that's kind of like what I concluded from what she's writing and her like view towards it. She seems like she's very like not disappointed, but very
okay. So right, and so because we're writing a summary, right? It's so important to make sure that you're conveying what's happening in the article, right? And so yeah, you have to kind of find a balance of like how you're interpreting that information. So we still want to potentially maybe use like what Graf and Birkenstein talk about, those voice markers, right? Like what's happening, who's saying what, things like that. And so in this instance, you can actually refer to the article. So if you say then she was confident but skeptical at the same time. And then I would say, however, her article reveals, right, that her views held in 2014 did not hold up very well. Okay. Now, I don't like putting the however at the end is not a problem. You can obviously do that. But I think because in this time you're going to be introducing this concept of her article reveals, it'll be a good idea to put that in the front. Okay. And I would say that when using the however at the end, probably would be for more like your argumentation, or if you're kind of writing something where you're chiming in with your own views and stuff like that. But for this, if you're saying, however, her article reveals that her views held in 2014 did not hold up very well. So then we add, you say her positive yet hesitant outlook of the future turned out to be the opposite. So now that makes more sense. Okay. And then you go on, a world controlled by big tech. So who's saying this now? Is this something that's in her article that she states?
Yeah, that's kind of like her, a quick summary of what she says in the article.
Okay, so then we would add that again. So you can say the author. What does she say about the controlled by big tech? And is it the internet?
Yeah, how they're controlling social media.
Okay. Now, these items that she lists, is that what she's contributing to what's negative about the internet, just to be clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just putting, I would probably write this differently, but I'm just kind of giving you example, right? So you can say the author claims that what is negative about the internet now is that it is controlled by big tech, biased, and unsociable individuals, and none of it could have been predicted back then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Back in 2014?
Yeah.
Article's argument focuses on this idea, how bad the situation got. Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Well, on how it was supposed to be a positive thing for the future, but since all these like big tech and companies essentially like created this like negative viewpoint for the internet, or yeah.
Okay, so you're kind of adding to the information that comes before, right? It seems, because she talks about big tech bias and unsociable individuals. Yeah. Okay, so you can then say she then explains, or you're saying these are her claims, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's suppressing development? The internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Perfect. So she then includes claims about the internet suppressing development, disconnecting people socially, stealing, and I'm going to just, for consistency, I'm going to say people's freedoms of thought, and keeping people hooked to the screen. Okay. And then we say all of this is presented through the use of general. Okay, so it looks like on page 2, at the end of the summary, you start kind of the critique. Remember, the summary is just to summarize the article, okay? You don't want to add any critique or criticisms here. So here, I think this is where you kind of start with your critique, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to actually delete all that. Are you okay with it?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I'm just saying because we're about to go in and critique it anyway. And so the summary, as I said before, should simply be what did the article say? Okay. Yeah. And so because you say it's presented through very little context and claims throughout, miscalculated predictions, these are all critiques. So what we can do for right now is I just cut it. And then I'm going to just paste it at the end of your paper just so we don't have it completely deleted.
No, yeah. Either way, I have another copy of it. So.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. So how are you feeling so far about the changes?
It's like, well, more concise to like who, like you're saying, who's talking, who's making the claim.
Right. Okay. Cool. So now this is your first body paragraph. Okay. Yeah. Now, before we dive into it, remember that each body paragraph, especially for something such as like a critical analysis, is we want to make sure that each body paragraph is focusing on one key idea, or at least in this case, one key critique. And what I mean by that is, what are you going to focus on, and how will I know? And that should happen in the topic sentence. Okay. So here you say the author's first claim in the argument focuses on how social media has essentially suppressed our development as a society. Right away, I don't really see any of what you're like, where's your critique here? All you're doing is just listing the first claim, right? But what I don't have is, what are you going to address about this first claim? What's like the issue here? And I'll ask you that question.
Well, in this first claim, it's kind of like my critique is how, again, like she doesn't really, well, in this first claim, she actually does give like good evidence and like background information that we're able to work with. But that's pretty much like, I'm just kind of like explaining how this first claim is like the only good claim that she has throughout the whole article.
Okay, so if it's the only good claim, remember that your thesis statement was focusing on the areas of criticism. Now, you could have done both if you wanted. That was an option if you felt like there was a good balance between positive and negative moves. But if you're saying there really was only one that was positive, but the rest was kind of negative, then all you have to do is focus on the elements that really made it weak instead of highlighting and showcasing the positive one. Does that make sense?
All right. Yeah.
Okay. And now, so my next question then is, as I read through this, you say it does a very good job. Her claims consistent throughout, but then you say these claims are surrounded by fallacies, like appealing to ignorance and anecdotes. So right away, this looks like a criticism to me. Okay. Now, is this like what you say after this line going to focus on those fallacies and stuff?
Which line, right? But even.
I'm on page 2. Sorry, are you there? I don't know if you're looking at.
Yeah, but I'm saying like which sentence after.
Did you see where I highlighted it? But these claims are surrounded. Okay, so I'm asking like if everything after this is focusing on this appeal to ignorance and anecdote.
No, I'm kind of saying how like even with those issues, she still manages to present a good claim.
Oh, okay. So this whole paragraph is looking at the positive thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
So should it be like the other way around?
Yeah. So like I said, if you are wanting to, again, because if you're drawing the conclusion that you're saying overall this argument is weak and here's why, then focus on that element, right? And we know that there are going to be some positive elements and negative elements in any argument anyway. That's just stands to reason. But if you're going to highlight the moves that really emphasize the parts that make the argument weak, that's what you're going to present, right? And so with that being said, if you feel, now this is only if you determine this, if you feel that there's a good balance of both positive and negative, then you can keep that, but you would have to go back in and restructure your intro and thesis statement to reflect that.
Right.
Because right now it's only saying the argument's weak and here's why, without talking about any of the positive parts. Because then at this point, by putting this paragraph in here, you can see how it might be confusing for a reader because we're expecting those critiques that you mentioned earlier in the thesis statement. Okay, so I guess the next question would be to you, the question would be, are these fallacies like appealing to ignorance and anecdotes, despite the fact that it was positive, did these factors affect the writing or the argument in any way? If they did, then you're going to have to restructure the paragraph to follow this and demonstrate the appeal to ignorance and anecdotes. If it isn't, or if you thought it wasn't that bad and whatever, you can sweep it under the rug, so to speak, then you'll just have to completely delete this whole paragraph. Okay, so that's a choice that you're going to have to make. Now, if you decide that you are like, you know what, now that I go back and reevaluate this, and the fallacies are problematic. And remember, when we're thinking about fallacies, they're not always, bad in the sense of, oh, there's one fallacy, the whole argument is a wash. Not necessarily. There's no argument that's going to be perfect. But what you do want to ask yourself is she continuously relying on these fallacies, right? The appeal to ignorance or using anecdotes all the time, all the way through an argument. Now, if somebody was going to tell me, right, or have this argument with me specifically and say, hey, I want to argue that the internet's actually bad for us, and all they use is their own personal anecdotes and experiences, I'm going to probably say that's going to be a little bit on the weaker side, right? Because there are a lot of other factors that we would have to take into consideration, especially in the context of this topic. Now, my questions would be, and this is where the rhetorical situation comes in, right? You're saying that this was published in 2018. We are now, you don't necessarily have to evaluate it from 2022, but from 2018, we still had a pretty good amount of different ways that the internet functions. And if she's only looking at Facebook, that might be a problem too, right? Because there were other social media outlets and platforms or whatever that could counteract her argument. about the internet being bad. And if she doesn't take those into account or look at some of these other platforms and is only using her experiences on Facebook, I would say that's probably weak, right? Especially because if Facebook's not the only social media platform. The other thing to consider with this argument is she only looking at the internet from a social media perspective, right? And so we know that the internet is not just social media. The internet is other elements. So does she include some of those conversations about that or data or whatever? And if that's not the case and she doesn't, and again, she's only relying on her personal experience and anecdotes, that is a huge problem in an argument because it's blatantly ignoring, right? You say appeal to ignorance. It's blatantly ignoring that there's a lot of factors that she's not taking into consideration in this argument. So what I will say to you is consider that when you think about this section here, okay? Because you will have to go back and revise. And so you'll have to decide, do I really want to focus on the positive aspects or do I really, really want to highlight these fallacies in the grand scheme of the argument? And so if that's the case, then what you'll do is revise this sentence where the topic sentence addresses the appeal to or the fallacies or the use of fallacies at the beginning of the topic sentence. And then you'll demonstrate throughout the body paragraph how that happened and why it's a problem. Okay. All right. So let's skip to the third page. We'll jump to that next one. And then you say in Wada's third and fourth claims, pathos and ethos are the primary form used to advance her argument. Okay. So when you say that, again, is this a criticism? So that's my next question again. Are you saying that this is a bad thing or a good thing?
Well, I'm explaining it because later on I kind of explain why she uses it as again an anecdote to move her personal bias towards it.
Well, I would explain that up here then in that top line. So that way you're preparing your reader for that discussion. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So yeah, so in this section, then you'll just want to explain. I'll just leave a little note here, okay? Okay. So you mentioned that pathos was her using personal experiences. So tell me why, how that's pathos.
So in one point of the claim, she uses it to kind of make you feel bad on. She kind of relates the experience she had with similar experiences that we may have. So kind of she moves that again she uses an anecdote in a way, using pathos to make you feel oh no, she's right. She the internet is distracting us. It's making us feel certain ways.
So using her personal experiences as a form of persuasion, kind of.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, and then ethos. Tell me what the ethos was. Was that just her using her experiences?
Yeah, but more specifically, on the last claim, she kind of again, not her personal claim, but again, she kind of relates it to us, and she gives the example of how when we watch Netflix, how we kind of start binging everything and forget what we're doing. So she kind of again uses that to relate to something that's become so common nowadays.
Okay, so showing that she understands that her credibility. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, use it again, relate it to us, so we could think, oh, she's right.
Okay. Then I notice at the end, you say she uses half-truth and false association of correlation and causation. So this is another area of critique that you'll have to show. So this will probably actually require its own paragraph.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because you just end the sentence there, but you have to show how she uses half-truth, what does that look like in the article, as well as correlation and causation, same thing.
Because like I kind of like build on what like her claim was, like with my own examples, but like I guess it would work better than as its own.
Yeah, because anytime you're going to say, here's what she does, you have to show us where does she do it, and then explain why it's a half-truth and why it's her attempt to use correlation and causation. Okay. So create. All right. Okay. So then finally, the same strategy battle issues, once again, our fourth claim. Okay. So then you talk more about pathos and ethos, right? Okay. And so she's pretty much using anecdotal evidence instead of like data that you feel should have been used, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So then you have the conclusion. Let's see here. Okay. I think the conclusion is strong. Except that I just put this as period here. And then works cited looks good. So really, a lot of what you'll just have to revise are the elements we highlighted in the body paragraphs, okay? So looking back then in our thesis statement, so rather than saying provide enough information for the audience, I would actually add that she relies predominantly on anecdotal evidence too. I would probably include that in there because it seems like that was a large part of how she tried to argue. I'm going to make a note of that in the thesis. Okay. Any questions?
Well, just like, would you say like that's kind of like the main like kind of issues with my paper? Like it's like it's confusing at times, I guess you could say. Like who's like making the claim?
Yeah, so on all the parts, we fixed the stuff that address that in the summary already. So the parts that you'll have to revise are going to be in the body paragraph. So the parts that we highlighted. Okay. So obviously in the first one, in the first main paragraph, the third paragraph, you'll have to go in and determine whether or not you want to keep the positive stuff in there. If you do, then you'll have to change the thesis. If not, then focus on the negative of her fallacies using appealing to ignorance and antidote, and then you'll revise the whole paragraph for that. Okay. And then in the following paragraph, I made notes where you would need to address the revisions that we talked about. Okay.
Let me just think if I have any other questions.
Okay.
Just to like reiterate, so if I decide to change the first claim to like talk about the negatives instead of the positives, would I have to change the whole like to align with that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah, well, that's pretty much all the questions I had.
Okay. If you have additional questions as you're going through, feel free to email me. I did record this session, so that way you can go back and watch it and look at those sections. It'll let you know when the recording's done, you know, I don't know what the word for it, rendering, I guess. And then you can access it anytime you want, okay?
So where can I like access it?
It's going to be under the big blue button where you go to the conferences.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
All right. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.